Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Bienvenue, Ministre. Thank you for coming. I believe it's our first time at committee together. When were you first made aware of the privacy breach that was reported in the CBC just a couple weeks ago?
Okay. Well, as you know, I can't speak of any specific occurrence. Mais ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que bon.
But what I can say is that as soon as I got to the agency in July last year, I had a comprehensive briefing on all potential fraud cases and the cases that were under investigation at the time. And every time after that point onwards, every time there was a somewhat important investigation, I was informed of the situation.
You were informed of fraud when you arrived at the CRA, when you received your first briefing, is that correct?
I had a general briefing on the different possibilities and on the past history.
But as it relates to the specific privacy breach that was reported with connection with H&R Block, when were you made aware of that case or those cases?
Vous savez.
Well, I'm sure that you know full well, Mr. Chambers, because of the Section 241 on the Income Tax Act. I cannot talk about specific cases.
Minister, I'm very familiar with Section 241. We are not talking about an in particular taxpayer at the moment. We're asking for when were you made aware? There is a briefing note, a memo, that has the sentence in it. Consensus is that gaps pose major risk to the agencies. Where there are internal funding, human resource considerations, all agree that visibility is needed. Do you recall receiving that memo?
Je reçois plusieurs mémos. Je suis briefée de différents.
I receive many memos, and I'm verbally briefed and in writing in different ways, so that doesn't surprise me.
To shed some light, this memo. Do you recall the memo that I'm referring to? This was reported in the CBC.
No, I do not.
No, you do not. Okay.
No, I do not. And I would just echo what the minister said. That
I have very limited time, Commissioner. I appreciate it. So, Minister, your testimony is that you cannot tell Canadians when you learned of a serious privacy breach that was reported in the news.
Je suis informée.
I am rapidly informed when the agency identifies a potential fraud case.
Be fair to say, if you're rapidly informed when the breach occurred, you likely would have been informed shortly thereafter, correct?
Absolument. Quand il y a une breach.
Absolutely. When there's a breach, a significant breach, I'm quickly informed.
So why was that breach not reported to the public as a material breach when you learned of it shortly after it occurred?
Alors, la façon dont on fonctionne à l'agence.
Well, the way they work at the agency is that as soon as there's doubt, there's identity theft. First off, they block the account, and we communicate with the individual or the individuals or the company that is concerned. So we inform that person directly. So it's only in cases where there is something that's more generalized. For instance, during COVID, we would go ahead with an at-large communication, but it's usually the person and the person's concerns. They were immediately informed.
Thousands of taxpayers affected. If this breach occurred outside of government, there are obligations for those organizations to publicly inform or inform the public. Why is it that this breach was not publicized, but worse, withheld from the Privacy Commissioner until after the deadline passed for him to include it in his report in 2024?
Je peux vous dire que déjà dans le.
Well, I can tell you that in the general report of the auditor for 2022, we had already started revealing or transferring this information, providing this information, because yes, today you're talking to me about a block of 31,000 identity theft cases, but this has happened across multiple years, many years. And if you go back to the Auditor General's report from 2022, you would see that there are already 23,000 cases that have been made public.
If the process at CRA works really well in that the minister is informed relatively shortly after you're made aware of privacy breaches that happened over multiple years, it's reasonable to assume that you or your predecessor were made aware of these privacy breaches well before the March deadline that the Privacy Commissioner needs in order to include these privacy breaches in their annual report to Parliament. Why was it that these privacy breaches were reported to the Privacy Commissioner after the deadline when your own testimony suggests that you would have been made aware of these privacy breaches well before the deadline to report these to the public?
Donc, moi, je suis informée rapidement.
Well, I'm quickly informed when there are attempts at identity theft, and then we need to validate. And to do that, we inform the individual or the individuals quickly, and then we report the situation. And as I said, we had already started reporting the situation in the AG report from 2022.
There have been very few breaches at the CRA because he was not made aware of them to include in his report in 2024. So the timeline just doesn't quite work for me at this moment, but I believe I've expired my time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chambers. Next, we're going to go to our friend from Chateauguay-Lacolle, Ms. Shan. Just made aware of that, Mr. Green, so I'm just wondering if we can have a bit of a test here to determine. Okay. Okay, so ça se termine notre premier tour. On va commencer le deuxième tour des questions.
So this is the end of our first round of questions, second round of questions. We are going to start with Mr. Berthold for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bibo, hello. In your opening remarks, Minister, you used government language. It's a beautiful, well-prepared speech without many details about what happened and the extent of it. And unfortunately, you did not really dwell on the impacts for citizens, because we're talking about 31,000 breaches in 2020, 2021, and 62,000 taxpayers seem to have been impacted. Have you been able to take care of all of those files? Well, the first thing I can reassure you of is that as soon as we have doubt that the individual is immediately informed. Well, you've already said that, Minister, but of these cases, how many people are still waiting for their situations to be rectified? Have you been able to rectify all of these situations? Well, I would need to turn to my team on that, but there are different levels of breach. In some cases, the scammer, for instance, may have achieved, for instance, access, but without really penetrating deep. While in cases of fraud where money was paid out, where people are being investigated, and when they're under investigation, no additional transactions are possible. I have 2 cases before me. I cannot, of course, say the names, but there is a complaint received on the 28th of April, 2023, and it took it took 2 years for this individual's case to be rectified. I have another case before me, which was reported on 20th of May, 2020, and it was taken care of 8th of October, 2024. So, Minister, when you read articles like this, when you read information like this, are you not personally touched or impacted by this? Of course I am, because each case is important. That much is clear, but there are different levels. But I'm talking about what you do, not what the agency does. When you see this, do you call the agency and tell them to take care of these situations quickly, or do you go, well, I'll wait and listen to the next briefing and we'll see, yes, this is not good, it's leaking into the media, so I'll go after the whistleblowers because this shouldn't be publicly available, this information. No, that's not what we do. But for people who are still waiting for their cases to be resolved, who are out of money, what do you have to say to them? Well, we have a big team working on this, and what I'm trying to tell you is that there are different levels of penetration or breach into the clients, into the individual's account. There are some cases that are quickly resolved. Some others are a bit more complicated and it takes more time. So we are here to help people, and we have protection systems that are in place. We are working with TransUnion to protect them too. Well, these cases should be resolved much more quickly because we're talking about people and families who don't have access to their money, who might not be able to buy food. So there are horrible numbers of people who are still waiting for a solution to their situation. And what we're hearing from you is that we're doing our best with our different levels. Again, once again, government language. But, Minister, you are responsible for the agency. Would you not want to shake things up a bit and tell them, hey, you have to resolve these cases in 2 months so that these people can carry on with their lives? Well, we can give you much more detailed examples, and you would see that we are trying to go as fast as possible, and it's not always dependent on what's available internally to the agency. There are some checks and controls that go beyond the agency, and we have to work in partnership with others when we don't have all the levers. Are there criminal complaints that have been filed to law enforcement services, agencies, in relation to these frauds? Is this a criminal organized network that we're looking at? Well, there are different types of attack that could be directed at the agency, but have there been complaints to law enforcement agencies? Well, we've had all kinds of cases, but how many law enforcement cases are there that are still pending or investigations that are going on? Well, this is on another file. I wouldn't be able to tell you how many investigations we have. Mr. Hamilton, would you be able to answer this question?
For sure, but what I can tell you is that when we look at these cases, and if we see there's a possibility of criminal activity, we have our own criminal investigators, and we can also refer them to the law enforcement authority.
Combien ont été référés, Monsieur le Président? Peut-être que le ministre pourrait.
How many have been referred to law enforcement, though?
It's very clear. How many have you sent to the police?
Yeah, how many? I would have to consult with my team about exactly how many, and we may even have to get back to you on that. But we do have the ability to do that, and that also applies not just in fraudulent cases like this, but also in tax evasion cases where we might see criminal activity.
Thank you.
Oh,
Non, on n'a pas de temps pour cette round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for appearing at committee. Mr. Commissioner, you mentioned about there was some delays in reporting the privacy breaches. Just trying to get a handle on the decision rights framework within CRA. Like, whose decision would it have been to not report those breaches in the timely manner?
Mr. Chair, I guess I take responsibility for what happens within the CRA. And it wasn't a conscious decision in the sense of, well, let's not report them. It was, we had a massive backlog. We were sorting out the process to report these privacy breaches because we hadn't had that number in the past. We had processes to first make sure we blocked the accounts to prevent the damage, inform the people, and then try to find out what went on. And then as time went by,
So the minister had no knowledge of this. So you're saying that the decision to not report was not a ministerial decision.
I'm sorry?
The decision to not report was not a ministerial decision.
Well, I guess I just take responsibility for it. It was a circumstance that we could.
Here's the issue. For example, since we're on this issue about decision rights, whose decision was it to reverse the decision on Bear Truss? Was it that a ministerial decision to reverse that decision, or was it a department decision to reverse the requirement to file for Bear Truss?
I'm trying to remember exactly how we came to that decision. But, I have some delegated authorities in that regard, and I'm sure I discussed it with the minister for sure.
Well, here's a former boss of mine said, you can always delegate responsibility but not accountability. And it seems to me that there's a bit of murkiness around decision rights, veto rights, who makes a recommendation and who ultimately decides. Because on one hand, if it's the department deciding on, as an example, Bear Truss, so the testimony is that the CRA can decide on its own not to implement a decision by the government or the finance department. It seems to me that there's a little bit of unclarity, or it's unclear about who actually is the final authority on some of these questions. So, I think we're going to poke a little bit more on that later, I hope. But with respect to these privacy breaches, the CRA says these are as a result of external breaches. There was no compromise to the CRA's systems as a result of these 31,000 cases? Is that?
Certainly the vast majority of cases arise from external threats. I don't think any of the 31,000 came from ours, but I'll ask my colleagues to that. And maybe just your previous question, I derive my powers from the minister. She can delegate them to me, so I'm sure you know how that works. But I don't know, Mark, if you want to add that.
For these identity theft cases that we were working on, we've been working on those cases since the summer of 2020, when they actually happened. And we've been contacting the taxpayers, making sure that we were talking to the right person and doing the inquiry to figure out what happened. And we took all the actions.
So I'm just going to cut in because I have
Yes.
a fair bit of time. The IRS has some fairly onerous protocols in place that would prevent, payments to people that live on like Tomato Street or what have you. Why is it that we seem to have taken this position? Have we not learned anything from COVID that the pay now, audit later function really hasn't worked out that well for taxpayers?
I think that what you're raising, is actually a very good question. And I can say from talking to my colleagues internationally, including the IRS, this is an issue that all tax jurisdictions are facing, that as we've moved into a more digital world, we can do things faster. But we also have to make sure, and that's good for service, but we also have to make sure that we have proper risk containment measures in place to be able to prevent bad things from happening. But you can't go to one extreme or the other. If we stopped everything and reviewed every transaction, then things would stop. But we also can't let them go through clearly. So I would argue that it's not clear to me that the IRS or anyone else has a better system of trying to strike that balance.
Is there an acceptable level of fraud that you think, if you pay out, I don't know, insert a number, $100 billion of payments to Canadians or $60 billion, is there a level that you say, you know what, speed is important, so if it's like 1%, it's not a big deal?
Yeah, I don't have a number for that, but in a sense, in concept, that what you're saying is great. You have to be able to risk manage and think about what is an acceptable level so that you strike that balance.
So in my remaining time, I have a few follow-up questions that are reasonably detailed with respect to like the memo from before. So we'll ask for that. I'll provide those to the clerk. So I hope we can maybe follow up in writing with some specific answers on what we've spoken about today. But just finally, why in 2019 would the department be totally fine with telling the public what's the largest single corporate tax write-off of $133 million, but today now try to hide behind the Section 241 with the largest corporate write-off?
Yeah, and maybe I will turn to my colleague, Mark Lemieux, for that. I don't have a particular memory of 2019.
Need a very quick response, please.
I was not there in 2019, so I can't respond to that question, but we got that question this year, and we validated, and we can't divulge that information.
Maybe you can circle back on that, Mr. Chambers, later, okay? Ms. Khalid for 6, go ahead.
Thank you very much.